The morning sun cast long shadows across the Kalahari Desert as President Hage Geingob of Namibia stood at the edge of what maps called the border with Botswana. But to him, this invisible line represented something much deeper than geography. It was a wound that had never properly healed, a scar left by colonial powers who had drawn lines across Africa with rulers in red ink, caring nothing for the families they separated or the ancient trade routes they severed. Dr. Amara Katanga, a historian from the University of Namibia, had spent 15 years documenting how these borders affected real people. She remembered her grandmother's stories about walking freely between what is now Namibia and Botswana to trade cattle and visit relatives. Those days ended abruptly when German colonizers arrived with maps that meant nothing to the local communities, but everything to the new administration. The idea for change began in a small village called Mamuno, right on the border between Namibia and Botswana. Maria Mbeki lived there with her family, but her situation was complicated in ways that outsiders could barely understand. Her house sat exactly on the borderline, with her kitchen technically in Namibia and her bedroom in Botswana. Every morning, she had to carry 2 different identity cards, 2 sets of currency, and navigate 2 different legal systems just to live her daily life. Maria's children attended school in Botswana because it was closer, but they were Namibian citizens. This meant constant paperwork, special permits, and endless bureaucratic headaches. When her youngest son broke his arm playing football, the nearest hospital was in Botswana, but as a Namibian, the medical costs were astronomical. The family faced bankruptcy over a simple childhood accident. Word of Maria's struggles reached Dr. Katanga, who saw in this family story a perfect example of how colonial borders continued to harm ordinary Africans decades after independence. She began documenting similar cases across the region. There was Joseph Mukendi, a cattle herder whose traditional grazing lands were split between Namibia and Zambia. Colonial administrators had drawn the border right through the middle of his ancestors' territory, forcing him to pay fees and obtain permits to move his cattle along routes his family had used for centuries. In Zambia's Sesheki district, Chief Mukuni faced similar challenges. His tribal territory had been artificially divided between Namibia and Zambia by colonial borders. Traditional ceremonies that had united his people for generations now required international negotiations. Young people from his tribe couldn't marry across the border without complex visa procedures that could take months or even years to complete. President Geingob listened to these stories during his regular community meetings. As someone who had lived through Namibia's struggle for independence, he understood the deep emotional and practical problems these colonial borders created. He began reaching out to his counterparts in Botswana and Zambia, Presidents Mokgweetsi Masisi and Edgar Lungu, sharing stories like Maria's and asking a simple but revolutionary question. Why should lines drawn by people who never lived in Africa continue to control African lives? The initial conversations happened quietly, away from media attention. The 3 presidents met at a cattle post in the Kalahari, a location chosen specifically because it belonged to all 3 countries culturally, even if colonial maps divided it artificially. They sat under an ancient baobab tree that had witnessed centuries of African history, including the arrival and departure of colonial powers. Dr. Sarah Malapo, a constitutional lawyer from Botswana, joined these early discussions. She brought decades of research showing how artificial borders had stunted economic growth across southern Africa. Communities that had traded freely for centuries were now separated by checkpoints, tariffs, and bureaucratic barriers. Traditional knowledge about water sources, seasonal patterns, and sustainable farming practices couldn't flow freely between communities that colonialism had arbitrarily divided. The presidents realized they were discussing something unprecedented in modern African history. While the African Union talked about continental integration, no one had seriously proposed completely dismantling colonial borders between sovereign nations. The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. They knew the international community would react with shock, concern, and probably strong opposition. As news of these secret meetings began to leak, reactions were immediate and intense. In Washington, State Department officials worried about regional stability, European diplomats expressed concerns about trade agreements and existing treaties. The African Union itself was divided, with some leaders praising the vision while others worried about setting dangerous precedents that could lead to chaos across the continent. But for people like Maria Mbeki, Joseph Mukendi, and Chief Mukuni, the discussions represented hope for the first time in decades. They had lived their entire lives dealing with problems created by people who had never set foot in Africa, never understood African communities, and never cared about the human cost of their arbitrary line drawing. The three presidents agreed to move forward carefully but decisively. They would spend months consulting with traditional leaders, community groups, legal experts, and ordinary citizens before making any formal announcements. They knew they were proposing something that would shock the world, but they also knew it was necessary for the future of their people. As President Geingob returned to Windhoek that evening, he carried with him the weight of history and the hope of millions of Africans who had been artificially separated by colonial ambition. The journey toward dismantling these borders would be complicated, controversial, and potentially dangerous. But for the first time since independence, Africa was taking control of its own geography. The announcement came on a Tuesday morning that would be remembered across Africa and around the world. President Geingob stood before a packed auditorium in Windhoek, flanked by Presidents Masisi and Lungu, as cameras from international news networks captured every word. The moment he began speaking, history started shifting. Today we announce our intention to dissolve the artificial borders imposed on our peoples by colonial powers, President Geingob declared. Namibia, Botswana, and Zambia will begin the process of reuniting communities that were never meant to be separated. The room erupted with gasps, applause, and furious note-taking from journalists who knew they were witnessing something unprecedented. Rebecca Thompson, CNN's Africa correspondent, had covered conflicts and elections across the continent, but she had never seen anything like this. She immediately understood the magnitude of what she was hearing. Three stable democratic nations were proposing to redraw the map of Africa based on African needs rather than colonial convenience. Her hands shook slightly as she typed her breaking news alert. In Maria Mbeki's border village of Mamuno, the announcement was met with tears of joy. Maria gathered her neighbors around her radio, and when they heard the news, elderly women began ululating in celebration. Her neighbor, Thomas Kagosana, and 78-year-old man who remembered life before the borders hardened, wept openly. "I thought I would die before seeing my people united again," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. The reaction in Washington was swift and concerned. Secretary of State Jennifer Walsh called an emergency meeting with her Africa team. Intelligence analysts worked through the night, trying to understand the geopolitical implications. Was this a challenge to Western influence in Africa? Would it destabilize the region? Would other African nations follow suit? The questions multiplied faster than anyone could find answers. Dr. Michael Harrison, an Africa specialist at Georgetown University, found himself fielding calls from news networks desperate to understand what was happening. "This isn't just about borders," he explained to a CNN anchor. "This is about Africans reclaiming control over their own continental geography for the first time since colonization. It's revolutionary, and frankly, it's long overdue." In London, the Foreign Office was in crisis mode. Britain had drawn many of these colonial borders, and officials worried about the precedent this might set for other former colonies. Sir James Wellington, the former British High Commissioner to Botswana, was asked to provide analysis on what he called a deeply concerning development that could unravel decades of diplomatic work. But in the affected communities, the reaction was overwhelmingly positive. Chief Mukuni in Zambia organized a celebration that lasted 3 days. Families separated by borders for decades began making plans to reunite. Traditional healers spoke of ancient prophecies being fulfilled. Young people started organizing cultural exchanges that had been impossible under the rigid border system. Dr. Amara Katanga found herself at the center of international media attention. News crews from BBC, Al Jazeera, and France 24 sought her expertise on the historical context of colonial borders. She explained how the Berlin Conference of 1884, 1885 had carved up Africa without consulting a single African, creating borders that deliberately broke up strong kingdoms and separated families to make colonial control easier. What these three presidents are proposing isn't radical, she told a BBC interviewer. What was radical was drawing these borders in the first place. They're simply correcting a historical injustice that has caused immeasurable suffering. Economic analysts were divided on the implications. Some worried about trade disruptions and currency complications. Others pointed to successful examples like the European Union, where border elimination had led to unprecedented prosperity. Professor Janet Mwangi from the University of Cape Town argued that removing colonial borders could unlock economic potential that had been artificially constrained for over a century. The African Union found itself in a difficult position. Secretary General Musa Faki Mahamat praised the vision while carefully noting that such changes needed to be carefully managed and thoroughly planned. Behind closed doors, member states were divided. Nigeria and South Africa expressed cautious support. Egypt and Morocco worried about implications for their own border situations. Kenya and Tanzania watched closely, remembering their own colonial border complications. Religious leaders across the three nations overwhelmingly supported the initiative. Archbishop Samuel Nkomo of Lusaka called it God's will finally being done. Islamic leaders in northern Namibia praised the reunification of Muslim communities. Traditional spiritual leaders saw it as the healing of sacred lands that had been unnaturally divided. The international business community reacted with nervous excitement. Mining companies worried about regulatory changes but also saw opportunities in a larger, integrated market. Tourism operators dreamed of creating cross-border safari experiences. Agricultural businesses anticipated new opportunities for regional food security. Social media exploded with reactions from around the world. Young Africans shared stories of families separated by colonial borders. Hashtags like Branham Border Free Africa and decolonized geography began trending globally. Videos of elderly people crying with joy went viral, showing the deep emotional impact of the announcement. Opposition voices emerged as well. Some traditional leaders worried about losing influence in a larger political structure. Urban professionals in capital cities feared economic disruption. International investors sought reassurances about existing contracts and agreements. President Masisi addressed these concerns in a follow-up press conference in Gaborone. "We understand the fears and concerns," he said. "This process will take years, not months. Every citizen will be consulted. Every treaty will be honored. Every investment will be protected. But we will not let fear prevent us from healing the wounds of colonialism." By the end of the week, delegations from academic institutions, international organizations, and neighboring countries were requesting meetings. The three presidents found themselves at the center of a global conversation about self-determination, sovereignty, and the lasting impacts of colonialism. As the initial shock began to settle, one thing became clear. Africa was no longer asking permission to control its own destiny. The continent that had been carved up by colonial powers was finally ready to reshape itself according to African needs, African values, and African dreams. The world would never be quite the same. The phone in President Biden's Oval Office rang at 3:47 a.m. Washington time. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan's voice was urgent, but measured as he briefed the president on what intelligence agencies were calling the most significant geopolitical development in Africa since the end of apartheid. Within hours, the Situation Room was filled with officials trying to understand implications that seemed to change by the hour. Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield, the U.S. representative to the United Nations, found herself fielding calls from diplomats around the world. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. What was America's position on three sovereign nations voluntarily dissolving their borders? The question had no precedent in modern international law, and legal experts were frantically searching through treaties and conventions for guidance that simply didn't exist. In Beijing, Chinese President Xi Jinping convened his own emergency session. China had invested billions in infrastructure projects across all three nations through the Belt and Road Initiative. Foreign Minister Wang Yi worried about existing agreements, mining contracts, and railway projects that suddenly crossed borders that might not exist in a few years. But privately, some Chinese officials saw opportunity in supporting African self-determination against Western interests. The European Union was perhaps most conflicted of all. In Brussels, Commission President Ursula von der Leyen faced pressure from member states with very different perspectives. Germany, having once colonized Namibia, felt historical responsibility, but also concern about regional stability. France worried about precedents for other former colonies. Meanwhile, smaller European nations saw parallels to their own integration and expressed cautious support. Dr. Elena Rostova, Russia's top Africa analyst, presented a fascinating perspective to the Kremlin. This could fundamentally reshape global power dynamics, she argued in a classified briefing. If successful, it proves that Western-imposed political structures can be peacefully dismantled. Other regions might follow suit. President Putin listened intently, seeing potential advantages in supporting moves that challenged Western-established international norms. The most emotional reactions came from other African nations. In Nigeria, President Bola Tinubu called the announcement the beginning of true African independence. Ghanaian President Nana Akufo-Addo spoke of our brothers and sisters finally healing the scars of colonialism. But reactions weren't uniformly positive across the continent. In Morocco, King Mohammed VI expressed private concerns to advisors about implications for Western Sahara. Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi worried about potential impacts on carefully negotiated Nile River agreements. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa found himself caught between supporting African unity and managing concerns from business leaders about regional economic stability. The United Nations faced an unprecedented constitutional crisis. Secretary General Antonio Guterres convened emergency consultations with legal experts who confirmed what everyone suspected. There was no established procedure for member states voluntarily dissolving borders while maintaining their UN membership. The charter assumed borders were permanent fixtures, not choices that nations could reconsider. Professor Maria Santos from São Paulo University became an unlikely expert on the crisis from a Latin American perspective. Brazilian media sought her analysis on what this meant for border disputes between Colombia and Venezuela, or historical tensions between Peru and Ecuador. The Africans are showing the world that borders drawn by outsiders don't have to be permanent, she explained to a packed auditorium. This could inspire peaceful border revision movements globally. International mining companies found themselves in legal limbo. Rio Tinto's diamond operations in Botswana suddenly faced uncertain regulatory futures. Copper mines in Zambia, owned by Swiss and Canadian companies, scrambled to understand potential changes to taxation, environmental regulations, and labor laws. Stock prices fluctuated wildly as investors tried to price in risks that had never existed before. The World Bank and International Monetary Fund faced their own complications. All three nations had separate loan agreements, development programs, and economic partnerships. Would these need to be renegotiated, combined, canceled? Dr. Kristalina Georgieva, IMF Managing Director, announced that the organization would work closely with the three nations to ensure economic stability during any transition. International law schools found themselves overwhelmed with requests for expert analysis. Harvard law professor Sarah Chen explained to CNN that while the proposal was unprecedented, it wasn't necessarily illegal under international law. Sovereignty means these nations have the right to determine their own borders, she said. The question isn't whether they can do this legally. They can. The question is whether they can do it practically. Tourism industries across the three nations experienced immediate impacts. Victoria Falls, shared between Zambia and Zimbabwe, suddenly faced questions about access and management. Safari operators who had navigated complex multi-country permit systems for decades found themselves planning for a future where such complications might disappear entirely. Booking inquiries actually increased as international tourists became curious about the region. Religious organizations worldwide took notice. The Vatican issued a careful statement supporting peaceful dialogue and respect for human dignity, while avoiding taking sides. The World Council of Churches praised the vision while calling for careful attention to minority rights. Islamic organizations in the Middle East saw parallels to historical discussions about recreating the Islamic Caliphate, though the contexts were completely different. Academic institutions globally began organizing conferences and research projects. Oxford University announced a special research initiative on post-colonial border revision. The University of Cape Town established a task force to study implementation challenges. Even institutions with no previous Africa focus found themselves drawn into discussions about sovereignty, self-determination, and the legacy of colonialism. International humanitarian organizations faced practical questions about operations that crossed the borders in question. Doctors Without Borders operated clinics in all three nations and wondered about regulatory changes. The Red Cross had established protocols based on existing borders that might need complete revision. UN refugee programs faced questions about status changes for people whose legal situations might shift dramatically. Perhaps most significantly, the announcement sparked conversations in other regions about their own colonial borders. Kurdish leaders noted similarities to their situation across Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Syria. Indigenous groups in the Americas pointed to how colonial powers had similarly divided their traditional territories. Even within Europe, some regional movements saw inspiration for their own autonomy aspirations. As the first week after the announcement concluded, one thing became clear. Three relatively small African nations had sparked a global conversation about fundamental assumptions of the international order. Questions that had seemed settled since the end of World War II were suddenly open for debate. The world was watching to see whether this bold African experiment would succeed or fail, and what it might mean for the future of national borders everywhere. The massive tent erected in Katima Mulilo, Namibia, could hold 3,000 people, but twice that number showed up for the first community consultation meeting. People had walked for days from remote villages, driven hundreds of kilometers from cities, and crossed existing borders illegally, just to have their voices heard in this historic process. The energy was electric, emotional, and sometimes explosive. Grace Simasiku, a 67-year-old grandmother from a village near the Zambian border, stood up during the open microphone session with tears streaming down her weathered face. Her voice shook as she spoke in Silozi, later translated for the international observers present. "My daughter lives 30 kilometers away, but I need a passport to visit her grave. She died 5 years ago, and I've only been able to visit twice because of these borders. Please, let me visit my child without begging officials for permission." The tent fell silent. Even the most skeptical observers felt the raw emotion of families torn apart by arbitrary lines on maps. Dr. Katanga, serving as one of the community liaison coordinators, made careful notes about each testimony. She knew these personal stories would be crucial in designing a new system that actually served people rather than bureaucrats. Joseph Hamutenya, a successful businessman from Windhoek, represented a different perspective. He stood confidently in his expensive suit and spoke in English for the international media present. "I've built my import business around existing trade regulations between our three countries. Suddenly changing everything could destroy the livelihoods of thousands of people like me. How will you protect our investments and our jobs during this transition?" The community consultation process revealed the complex reality behind the simple dream of unified borders. Traditional leaders like Chief Mayuni of the Lozi people spoke passionately about reuniting their ethnic group, currently split between all three nations. But urban professionals worried about currency instability, job transfers, and property rights. Young people dreamed of opportunities to study and work across the region, while older citizens feared losing social benefits they had earned under current systems. In Francistown, Botswana, similar meetings drew thousands. Maria Kagomo, a nurse who had worked on both sides of the Namibia-Botswana border, shared her frustration with medical emergencies. "A child dies while we argue about which country should pay for emergency treatment. Diseases don't respect borders, and neither should healthcare." Her testimony, recorded and shared across social media, went viral globally and became a powerful symbol of why change was necessary. But not everyone supported the dramatic changes. Peter Mwanawasa, a customs officer in Kasane, worried about his career and pension. I've spent 20 years learning these border regulations. What happens to people like me if borders disappear? Will I lose my job? Will my pension transfer to a new system? Nobody has answered these basic questions. His concerns were shared by thousands of government workers whose livelihoods depended on maintaining borders. The consultation process also revealed unexpected cultural complications. Different nations had developed distinct approaches to issues like marriage laws, land ownership, and traditional authority. Elizabeth Nangolo, a women's rights advocate from Namibia, worried about women losing legal protections if they move to areas with different marriage laws. We've fought for decades to achieve gender equality in Namibian law. We can't let unification reverse those gains. Young people brought energy and optimism to every meeting. 22-year-old John Matunga, a university student from Lusaka, spoke for many in his generation. Our grandparents traded freely across this region. Our parents were trapped by colonial borders. We want to be the generation that heals this wound and builds something better. Youth organizations across all three nations organize support rallies, social media campaigns, and cross-border exchanges to demonstrate their commitment to change. The religious dimension proved equally complex. While most Christian and traditional leaders supported unification, practical questions arose. Reverend Paul Mushimba from a Methodist church in Livingstone, Zambia asked, "Our church structure follows national boundaries. Will we need to reorganize everything? What about our partnerships with international denominations?" Similar questions came from Muslim communities, traditional healers, and other faith groups. Economic concerns dominated many discussions. Small-scale traders who had built businesses around border arbitrage worried about losing their livelihoods. Margaret Zulu made money by buying goods cheaply in Zambia and selling them in Namibia, where different tax structures created price differences. "Border trade feeds my family," she explained. "If prices equalize, how will I survive?" The consultation process also uncovered the deep trauma that colonial borders had inflicted on African communities. Dr. Samuel Moyabi, a psychiatrist from Gaborone, documented what he called border separation syndrome among families divided by artificial boundaries. Children grow up not knowing half their extended family. Traditional knowledge systems are broken. Cultural practices are disrupted. The psychological damage is generational and profound. Environmental concerns emerged as another crucial factor. Dr. Jennifer Mwanza, a wildlife biologist studying elephant migration patterns, explained how colonial borders had disrupted ancient animal migration routes. Elephants don't carry passports, but they need to move freely for feeding and breeding. Current borders force them into human-wildlife conflicts that wouldn't exist if traditional migration patterns were respected. The most emotional meetings happened in border communities where the human cost was most visible. In Kazungula, where Namibia, Botswana, and Zambia meet, families shared stories of being separated by rivers that had become international boundaries. Children spoke about friends they couldn't visit. Farmers described ancestral lands they couldn't access. Healers talked about medicinal plants that grew on the wrong side of borders. International observers were struck by the sophistication and passion of community input. Ambassador Sarah Martinez from Chile, representing a UN observer mission, noted, "These communities understand the implications better than most diplomats in New York. They're not just talking about politics, they're talking about their daily lives, their families, their future." Opposition voices were also given platforms. Some traditional leaders worried about losing influence in a larger political structure. Urban intellectuals questioned whether the proposed changes were too radical, too fast. Business leaders sought guarantees about existing contracts and property rights. Even some liberation struggle veterans worried that dismantling borders might somehow dishonor the sacrifices made to achieve independence. As weeks of consultations continued, patterns emerged. Rural communities overwhelmingly supported change, seeing immediate benefits to their daily lives. Urban populations were more divided, weighing economic opportunities against stability concerns. Young people strongly favored unification, while older citizens were more cautious. Women often supported changes that would give them more options, while men sometimes worried about losing established privileges. The three presidents attended many of these sessions, listening carefully to citizen concerns and taking detailed notes. President Masisi was particularly moved by a meeting in Maun, where an elderly San leader spoke about how colonial borders had forced his nomadic people to choose artificial nationalities that meant nothing in their traditional worldview. By the end of the community consultation phase, one thing was clear. The people most affected by colonial borders understood their costs better than anyone else. Their voices, sometimes supporting and sometimes questioning the proposed changes, would shape whatever came next in this unprecedented experiment in African self-determination. The emergency session of the United Nations Security Council was unlike any in recent memory. Ambassador Jiang Wei of China sat across from U.S. Ambassador Robert Wood, while representatives from 15 nations grappled with a question that had no precedent. Should the international community intervene to prevent three sovereign nations from voluntarily changing their borders? This sets a dangerous precedent, argued the French representative, Ambassador Nicolas de Rivière. If we allow nations to arbitrarily redraw borders, we risk destabilizing the entire post-colonial order. His words carried the weight of France's extensive interests across Africa, from military bases to uranium mines to cultural influence programs worth billions of dollars. But Ambassador Fatima Kyari Mohammed of Nigeria stood firm in support of her African neighbors. With respect to my French colleague, the current borders weren't drawn by Africans. They were imposed by European colonizers who never consulted the people who had to live with their arbitrary lines. These three nations are simply exercising their sovereign right to correct a historical injustice. The debate raged for 14 hours, broadcast live across the globe. In the end, the Security Council reached an unprecedented compromise. They would neither endorse nor condemn the border changes, but would monitor the process to ensure it remained peaceful and democratic. It was a victory for the three African nations, but it came at a cost. Within days, economic pressure began mounting. The European Union announced a review of all trade agreements with the three nations. The IMF suspended new loan programs pending clarification of the political situation. International credit ratings agencies downgraded all three countries' bonds, making borrowing more expensive and scaring away foreign investment. President Geingob convened an emergency economic summit in Windhoek with his counterparts from Botswana and Zambia. The meeting was tense as economic advisors presented increasingly grim projections. Dr. Felix Mutati, Zambia's former finance minister, laid out the stark reality. We're looking at potential economic isolation. Foreign investment could dry up. Our currencies are already under pressure. We need to find alternative sources of support quickly. The solution came from an unexpected source. During a private dinner meeting, President Masisi received a call from Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. "Brother," Abiy said, "Africa is watching what you're doing. We may not be ready to dissolve our own borders yet, but we can support your economic needs during this transition. The African Development Bank stands ready to help." Within weeks, a new coalition of support emerged. Nigeria offered preferential trade agreements. South Africa promised investment guarantees. Ghana provided technical expertise for managing the transition. Kenya offered to share experiences from the East African community's integration process. Most significantly, the African Development Bank announced a special $5 billion fund to support innovative African integration initiatives. But economic pressure was only one challenge. Constitutional lawyers across all three nations worked around the clock to address the legal complications of border dissolution. Dr. Namsa Daniels, a constitutional expert from the University of Witwatersrand, led a team trying to resolve citizenship issues, property rights, taxation systems, and judicial procedures. "We're essentially creating new legal frameworks from scratch," she explained to a gathering of international legal experts. In Geneva, citizens need certainty about their rights, their property, their pensions, their access to services. This isn't just about removing border posts. It's about building entirely new systems of governance. The most complex challenge involved harmonizing 3 different legal systems that had evolved separately since independence: Namibia's Roman Dutch law, Botswana's English common law, and Zambia's mixed system created complications for everything from marriage contracts to mining rights. Teams of lawyers worked through the night for months, creating hybrid legal frameworks that protected existing rights while enabling integration. Traditional leaders faced their own obstacles. Chief Linyanti of the Lozi people, whose territory spanned all 3 nations, found himself mediating between different groups of traditional authorities who had grown apart during decades of separation. Some chiefs worried about losing influence, others about changing customs, and still others about managing larger, more complex traditional territories. The solution came through innovative compromises. A new council of traditional leaders would represent all ethnic groups across the integrated region, with rotating leadership and shared ceremonial duties. Traditional courts would maintain their authority within ethnic communities while coordinating with modern legal systems. Ancient trade routes and cultural practices would be restored while respecting contemporary national institutions. Perhaps the biggest obstacle was technical: the practical challenge of integrating 3 different government systems. IT specialists worked to merge tax systems, vehicle registration databases, and social service records. Simple questions became complex problems. How do you merge pension systems with different retirement ages? How do you integrate healthcare systems with different provider networks? How do you coordinate school curricula across 3 education systems? Dr. Patience Mutape, a systems integration expert from Zimbabwe, led the technical coordination effort. We're essentially building the backbone of a new country while keeping 3 existing countries running normally, she explained. It's like performing heart surgery while the patient runs a marathon. Currency integration proved particularly challenging. While all 3 nations used different currencies, economic advisors recommended gradually moving toward a common regional currency. The South African Reserve Bank offered technical assistance, while the African Union provided policy guidance based on failed attempts at monetary union elsewhere on the continent. International mining companies, initially resistant to the changes, began seeing opportunities. Rio Tinto's CEO, Jakob Stausholm, announced that the company would actually increase investments in the region. A larger integrated market with streamlined regulations could be more efficient for our operations than managing 3 separate regulatory systems, he said during a video conference with investors. Opposition parties within all 3 nations initially criticized the integration process, but public opinion polls consistently showed majority support. Maria Gothi, leader of Botswana's opposition umbrella for democratic change, shifted her position after extensive consultations with constituents. If this is what our people want and if it can be done safely and democratically, we should support it, she announced. The breakthrough came when the African Union formally endorsed the process and offered institutional support. AU chairperson Azali Assoumani praised the 3 nations for showing the continent a new path toward unity and prosperity. The AU's endorsement unlocked additional international support and gave legitimacy to the integration process. Technical obstacles that seemed impossible began falling one by one. Mobile phone networks extended coverage across borders. Banking systems enabled cross-border transactions. Universities began accepting students from all 3 nations without international student procedures. Healthcare systems started recognizing each other's insurance and treatment protocols. By the end of the first year after the announcement, the integration process had overcome its most serious challenges. Economic indicators actually improved as trade barriers fell, and investment in the region increased. International skeptics began acknowledging that the process was succeeding beyond most expectations. The 3 presidents met again under the same baobab tree where they had first discussed their vision. This time, they were joined by traditional leaders, youth representatives, business leaders, and ordinary citizens whose lives had already begun improving as colonial borders became increasingly irrelevant to daily life in the heart of southern Africa. 2 years after the historic announcement, Maria Mbeki stood in the same spot where her house had once straddled two countries. But now, instead of carrying two sets of identity papers, she held a single document, a citizenship card for the newly formed Kalahari Federation. Her kitchen and bedroom were finally in the same country, and her children could attend the nearest school without international student visas. The transformation ceremony took place on a brilliant October morning at the convergence point where Namibia, Botswana, and Zambia had once met. Now, instead of 3 border posts with barriers and checkpoints, a beautiful peace garden welcomed visitors with flowers from all 3 former nations and a monument celebrating African unity. Presidents Geingob, Masisi, and Lungu stood together, as the old border markers were ceremonially removed and replaced with a single flagpole, flying a new flag that incorporated symbols from all 3 cultures. Dr. Amara Katanga, the historian who had documented the human cost of colonial borders, found herself overwhelmed with emotion as she watched families reuniting without bureaucratic barriers for the first time in over a century. Today, we're not just removing borders, she said to the international media gathered for the ceremony. We're healing wounds that have festered since the Berlin Conference of 1885. The numbers told the story of transformation. Cross-border trade had increased by 340% as artificial barriers disappeared. Tourism revenue jumped by 280% as visitors could now experience Victoria Falls, the Okavango Delta, and the Namib Desert as part of seamless travel experiences. Most importantly, over 200,000 families had been reunited with relatives they hadn't seen regularly for decades. Joseph Mukendi, the cattle herder, whose grazing lands had been split by colonial borders, now moved his livestock freely along ancient migration routes his ancestors had used for centuries. His cattle were healthier, his profits had doubled, and most significantly, he no longer felt like a stranger in his own ancestral territory. My grandfather's spirit can finally rest in peace, he said, looking across the vast landscape that was once again unified. The integration had not been without challenges. Currency harmonization took 18 months longer than planned. Some government workers lost jobs as duplicate administrative systems were merged. A few traditional leaders struggled with reduced individual authority in the new federated traditional council system. But opinion polls consistently showed 78% approval ratings for the integration process, with highest support coming from young people and rural communities. The success attracted global attention. A delegation from Kurdistan visited to study the federation model. African Union officials discussed applying lessons to other regions with artificial colonial borders. The European Union invited the Kalahari Federation to share experiences with peaceful integration processes. Most significantly, Morocco and Algeria began quiet discussions about their own colonial border complications. Chief Mukuni stood before the largest traditional ceremony in living memory, with representatives from dozens of ethnic groups that had been artificially separated by colonial borders. Speaking in Lozi, later translated into English, Afrikaans, and Portuguese, he declared, "Our ancestors are smiling today. The children they could not visit, the sacred sites they could not reach, the traditions that were broken, all are restored. This is not the end of our journey, but the beginning of healing." The economic transformation exceeded even optimistic projections. The new Kalahari Federation became the fastest-growing economy in southern Africa. Mining companies found that integrated operations were 30% more efficient than managing separate national subsidiaries. Agricultural productivity increased dramatically as farmers could access larger markets and share traditional knowledge across former border lines. Universities experienced perhaps the most dramatic changes. The University of Kalahari, formed by merging campuses from all 3 former nations, became the largest institution of higher learning in southern Africa. Students could now study mining engineering in Botswana, wildlife management in Namibia, and copper metallurgy in Zambia, as part of integrated degree programs. Professor Sarah Malapo, who had advised the presidents during early legal consultations, became the Federation's first vice-chancellor. Healthcare improvements were immediately visible. The regional health system could now deploy specialists wherever they were needed without visa complications. Dr. Maria Gomo, the nurse who had testified about children dying during border bureaucratic delays, was promoted to regional emergency coordinator. No child will ever again die waiting for permission to cross an artificial line for medical treatment, she promised during her acceptance speech. The international community's initial skepticism gradually transformed into admiration. The World Bank published a case study calling the Kalahari Federation a model for peaceful post-colonial integration. The United Nations Development Program established a special office in the Federation to study replicable lessons for other regions. Even former skeptics acknowledged the success. Sir James Wellington, the former British High Commissioner who had initially called the integration deeply concerning, published an op-ed in the Times of London, admitting he had been wrong. The Kalahari Federation has proven that Africans are perfectly capable of determining their own political geography, he wrote. Perhaps it's time for the international community to stop treating colonial borders as sacred and start respecting African agency. The ripple effects extended far beyond southern Africa. Young people across the continent began organizing border-free Africa movements. Academic conferences on post-colonial political geography became major international events. The African Development Bank established a special fund for integration innovation that supported similar initiatives across the continent. As the sun set on the second anniversary of the Federation's establishment, the three founding presidents met once more under their ceremonial baobab tree. But they were no longer presidents of separate nations. They now served as rotating leaders of a united federation that had captured the world's imagination and proven that colonial wounds could heal through African solutions. President Geingob, now serving his term as Federation President, reflected on the journey. "We didn't just remove borders," he said to the small gathering of family members, advisors, and friends. "We proved that Africa can reshape itself according to African needs, African values, and African dreams. This is what true independence looks like." The Kalahari Federation had become more than a political experiment. It had become a symbol of African possibility, a proof that colonial damage could be repaired, and a beacon of hope for communities around the world still struggling with borders imposed by foreign powers who had never understood local realities. Maria Mbeki, now 69 years old, sat on her porch that evening, watching her grandchildren play in a yard that had once been split between two countries. They were growing up in a world where their grandmother's struggles with arbitrary borders seemed like ancient history. For them, the idea that families could be separated by lines drawn by strangers would seem as foreign as colonialism itself. As night fell across the Kalahari Desert, the lights of communities once divided by colonial borders now twinkled together in a unified landscape. The artificial scars had healed, the wounds had closed, and Africa had taken another step toward determining its own destiny. The ancestors, as Chief Mukuni had predicted, were indeed smiling.